There is a fear in Vampire. It is not one that is found in depictions of bodily harm or that of startling, monstrous specimens. While physical and observable threats are present in Vampire, Carl Theodor Dreyer's film stands apart from the tone and execution of its Universal Studios horror counterparts. Released 1 year after Universal's Dracula and Frankenstein, Vampire premiered in Berlin in 1932. As Dreyer's first sound film and his directorial follow-up to 1928's The Passion of Joan of Arc, critics were quick to reference the likelihood of Dreyer having been swayed by the American horror vogue. The film in question, however, displayed a formalism much more akin to the tradition of European art cinema, and aspects of the avant-garde, notably surrealism and expressionism. With a loose, often opaque narrative and emphasis on its stark and shadowy cinematography, Vampire occupies a unique spot in the historical transition from silent to sound film. While spoken dialogue is present, Vampire relies heavily on on-screen text, both diegetic and otherwise, to deliver its narrative in much the same manner as a silent film and its use of intertitles. The dialogue that is present is delivered in unique and unconventional ways. Dreyer frames or edits many dialogue sequences in ways that obscure the speaker. This distortion of spectatorship extends to other aspects of the film's presentation, such as the way the audience's gaze, as embodied by the protagonist, Alan Gray, and enacted through Dreyer's cinematography, is frequently presented through a kind of surreal subjectivity. Vision is never straightforward in Vampire, and the narrative is dependent on this ambiguity in the establishment of its generic identity. Vampire, through its unconventional use of sound and expressionistic visuals, is a film that utilizes its technical shortcomings as a product of the transition to sound to bolster its formal presentation to its generic and thematic ends. So firstly, how does Vampire use framing and the manipulation of space to evoke horror? In a film so dependent on the distortion of spectatorship, the audience can find its surrogate in the gaze of the protagonist, Alan Gray, played not by a professional actor, but by the aristocrat Baron Nicholas de Gunsberg. Gray is a peculiar protagonist due to the fact that he is often separated from the action. He is a passive presence more often than an active one, and he is not the one, in the end, who is responsible for the staking of the vampire, here represented as an old woman named Marguerite Chopin. This, however, is one of the unique aspects of the film's presentation that contributes towards its generic identity. Vampire is horrifying more for its suggestions and deliberate visual misconstruence than for any straightforward depiction of violence. This is exemplified early on with the death of the chatelaine and his manor, shot in the back by one of the vampire's henchmen. Gray is physically removed from the action, trapped outside and peering inward through a window, incapable of helping the man. The actual murder is shown primarily by a shadow cast upside down on the ceiling. We see only a suggestion of the murderer and his weapon, and a reaction from the victim, though the silhouette is enough to suggest the identity of a character we've seen before, one whose shadow is known to exist independently of his corporeality, just as the corporeality of the film is not always in alignment with its narrative. This narrative visual misalignment reaches its most extreme point in the film's third act, when Alan Gray, drained of blood by a nefarious doctor, passes out on a bench and awakes into an out-of-body experience. Stumbling upon his own dead body, the subsequent change of perspective from the spectral Alan to the corporeal but deceased Alan removes even more agency from the audience's gaze, locking it to the conscious perspective of the dead. As Alan is sealed into his coffin, the window through which the doctor and then the vampire Marguerite observe his body creates a frame within a frame, subverting the function of gaze as the protagonist and audience become the object and the characters within the film the subject. This sequence adds little development towards the overall narrative, but is the most unsettling in its disjunction of spectator, protagonist, and active and passive roles. The sequence concludes with the coffin being paraded past Alan's sleeping specter before the funerary procession fades, and Alan is returned to corporeality, destroying the physical validity of the scene while rejecting the explanation of the typical dream sequence. Images displayed in the sequence pay off as having been legitimate and not imagined. Beyond evoking horror through denial of key visual elements, Dreyer's choice to obscure or distort his framing plays into a separate creative motivation, this being dialogue and the nature of Vampire's multinational release. Vampire is not, in any way, a dialogue-heavy film. Of the 467 separate shots in Vampire, only 66 contain audible dialogue, and of these, the speaker's mouth is only visible in 31, accounting for 7% of the film's 73-minute runtime. This continues the trend of obscuring seemingly normal visual information towards the end of creating an atmosphere of unease and unknowability. However, it also makes the process of dubbing easier to accomplish. As the popularization of sound made films less exportable, a solution to maintain the viability of foreign markets was to shoot films in multiple languages. Subtitles weren't considered viable due to the previously established norm of intertitles making simultaneous reading and watching a task that was unpopular with audiences, and dubbing was equally disliked in dialogue-heavy films. Dreyer, working with a smaller budget than Joan of Arc but aiming for a multinational release, made the circumstances of Vampire's production work to the benefit of its genre. The film was shot in German, with post-production in Berlin synchronizing both a French and English dialogue track. The original German track is the most widely available version of the film, with any and all English versions having either been destroyed or lost. In order to minimize the disjunction of syncing English and French with an original German track, Dreyer's framing of dialogue follows similar rules to the expression of agency through gaze. Early on, Alan's interactions with an innkeeper are edited to show the reactions of those spoken to, but not the speaker, and the death of the chatelaine, again, is shot to hide the speaker's mouth, just as the framing hides the murderer. Exchanges that would otherwise be innocuous are given an unsettling quality when they are framed in such a way. The distinction between choices made towards artistic, surrealist ends and those made for convenience is just as ambiguous as Vampire's shifting subjectivity, but either despite or because of these qualities, the film is effective in fulfilling its generic identity through suggestion and disorientation. As shadows are suggestive of a physical threat, they take on a thematic and narrative purpose, emphasized by misty cinematography's shifting shades of gray. It even contains themes consistent with Dreyer's other filmography, despite being a more modest production. Age, youth, the inevitability of death, and the struggle between good and evil are all present in Vampire, and though its sometimes inscrutable nature makes it less accessible than the straightforwardness of a film like The Passion of Joan of Arc, its unique approach to genre and the way it navigates a multinational release as Dreyer's first sound film make it both significant in the scope of film's development and truly frightening in its own right.